He thought he understood power, control, and loyalty, but in the next few seconds, he was about to learn what real strength looked like. Ethan Cole stepped out of his black SUV, the engine still humming behind him as the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the sidewalk, the kind of golden light that made everything look softer than it really was. But nothing about Ethan's world had ever been soft. Not the tailored suit hugging his 6'3" frame, not the cold precision in his gray eyes, and certainly not the silent line of men behind him who moved only when he did, breathing only when he allowed it. Because in this part of the city, Ethan Cole didn't just walk the streets, he owned them. Every storefront, every corner, every quiet glance that quickly turned away when people recognized the weight of his presence. And yet, in that moment, something didn't fit, something small and almost invisible in a world he controlled too well, something that made his steps slow, then stop entirely, because just 20 feet ahead, right in the middle of a crowded sidewalk where people pretended not to stare, his mother stood trembling, her elegant posture gone, her usual composure replaced by something fragile, something unfamiliar. And she wasn't alone, not surrounded by the security detail that was supposed to never leave her side, not held steady by trained professionals who knew the cost of failure, but instead leaning, almost collapsing, into the arms of a woman no one would have looked at twice. A woman with worn shoes and a faded coat, her dark hands steady as they supported Margaret Cole like. It was the most natural thing in the world, like she had every right to be there, like she belonged in a moment that didn't belong to her at all. And around them, the tension was already building, subtle but sharp, the way people shifted, the way whispers started without words, the way Ethan's men exchanged quick, uncertain glances because they didn't understand what they were seeing. And when his lead bodyguard took a step forward, instinct overriding protocol, the air seemed to tighten. Because in Ethan's world, nothing happened without reason, and strangers didn't get close, especially not like this, especially not to someone like Margaret Cole. And yet the woman didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even look up, her focus entirely on the older woman in her arms, as if the entire world had narrowed down to one simple truth, that someone needed help and she was there to give it. No hesitation, no calculation, just quiet, unshaken presence. And that was the moment Ethan felt it, something unfamiliar, something he couldn't immediately name, because for the first time in years, control slipped, just for a second, just enough for him to realize that whatever was happening in front of him wasn't a threat, but it also wasn't something he could command. And as the city noise seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the steady rhythm of his own breath, Ethan Cole stood completely still, frozen between instinct and something deeper, watching a scene that didn't belong in his world. And yet somehow, it was about to change everything he thought. He knew. The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and fragile, like something that could shatter if anyone moved too quickly. And yet movement came anyway, subtle at first, a shift of weight, a glance exchanged, the quiet signal Ethan's men had been trained to recognize. Uncertainty, and uncertainty was something they were never allowed to show. But this was different, because nothing in their training had prepared them for this exact moment. Not the sight of their boss standing still, not giving orders, not stepping forward, not reacting the way he always did, and certainly not the sight of Margaret Cole, a woman who had spent decades surrounded by structure and control, now leaning into the steady arms of someone who did not belong to any system they understood. And as one of the bodyguards cleared his throat softly, almost cautiously, Ethan did not look at him, did not acknowledge the silent request for direction. His eyes remained fixed on the woman holding his mother, studying her now, not just seeing her presence, but observing the details, the worn edges of her sleeves, the faint dust on her shoes, the way her posture remained firm despite the weight she was supporting, and most of all, the calm in her face, not the kind of calm that came from confidence or authority, but something quieter, something rooted deeper, as if she had made a decision long before anyone noticed her, a decision that did not depend on who was watching or what might happen next. And that was what unsettled him, because in his world, every action had a cost, every move was calculated, every gesture measured against risk and reward. But there was no calculation here, no hesitation, just a simple act carried through to its end. And when his mother shifted slightly, her hand tightening around the woman's arm. Ethan saw it clearly. The trust, immediate and unguarded. Something Margaret Cole did not give easily, something she had rarely shown even to him. And the realization settled slowly, heavy and undeniable, that whatever had happened in the moments before he arrived, whatever had brought them to this exact point on this crowded sidewalk, it had changed. Something in her, because she was not pulling away. She was not asking for help from the familiar faces surrounding her. She was staying exactly where she was, supported by someone she had only just met. And then, finally, Ethan moved, not with the sharp command that usually defined him, not with the presence that parted crowds without effort, but with something quieter, more deliberate. Each step measured as he closed the distance between them, and as he did, the surrounding noise seemed to shift again, conversations lowering, footsteps slowing, people sensing that something important was unfolding even if they did not understand it. And when he stopped just a few feet away, close enough to see the fine lines of exhaustion in his mother's face, close enough to hear the steady rhythm of her breathing, he spoke, his voice controlled but softer than anyone there had ever heard it, asking a simple question that carried more weight than any order he had ever given. What happened? And for a brief moment, no one answered. Because the answer did not belong to power or status or expectation. It belonged to the woman who had stepped forward when no one else did. And she did not rush, did not look intimidated, did not react to the quiet tension surrounding her. She simply adjusted her grip slightly to make Margaret more comfortable, her voice calm, and even as she finally spoke, as if she were explaining something ordinary, something that did not need to be justified, she almost fell. I just did not want her to be alone. And the words landed differently than anything Ethan had expected, not dramatic, not defensive, just honest. And in that honesty, something shifted again, deeper this time, something he could not ignore. The words did not echo, they settled, quiet and unshaken, as if they carried no need to defend themselves. And that was what made them impossible to ignore, because Ethan Cole had heard thousands of explanations in his life, polished, rehearsed, filled with urgency or fear, but never something so simple that it left no space for doubt. And as he stood there, his gaze fixed on the woman who had spoken without hesitation, he realized she was not looking at him the way others did. There was no flicker of recognition, no shift in posture, no sudden awareness of who he was or what his presence meant. And that absence of reaction created a strange imbalance in the moment, because power depended on acknowledgement, and she was offering none of it. Her attention remained on Margaret, her hand adjusting slightly again, steady, patient, making sure the older woman was comfortable. And when Margaret exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction, it confirmed something Ethan had not yet fully accepted, that whatever this woman had done before he arrived, it had worked, and it had worked in a way his own people had failed to. And behind him, one of the guards shifted again, more urgently this time, the discomfort growing, because protocol demanded resolution, demanded control be re-established, but Ethan still did not move to end it. Instead, his eyes lowered briefly to his mother, taking in the details he had almost missed at first, the faint tremor in her fingers, the slight pallor in her skin, the way her usual sharp composure had softened into something more vulnerable. And then she spoke, her voice quieter than usual but clear enough to cut through everything else. I was walking, she said slowly, choosing each word with care, and then the ground felt unsteady, and before anyone else even noticed, she caught me. Her grip tightened gently around the arm supporting her, as if to emphasize the truth of it, and she did not let go. And that last part lingered, heavier than the rest, because it was not just about what had happened, it was about what had not happened. No one else stepping in, no one else staying, and Ethan's gaze shifted. Again, returning to the woman, studying her more closely now, not as a stranger out of place, but as someone who had made a choice in a moment where most would have walked past. And something about that choice did not align with anything he understood about the world he operated in, because there had been no gain in it, no advantage, no reason beyond the one she had already given. And as the realization settled deeper, it brought with it a discomfort he was not used to, not fear, not anger, but something closer to awareness, the kind that forced him to see beyond the structures he had built around himself. And for a brief second, his expression shifted, subtle but undeniable, the hardness in his eyes giving way to something less defined, something searching. And then he did something that none of the people watching could have predicted. He stepped closer, closing the final distance between them, not to take control, not to separate them, but to stand within the space they had created. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter still, stripped of its usual edge, asking a question that was no longer about the situation but about the person in front of him. "What is your name?" And for the first time, the woman looked up, meeting his gaze directly, not with defiance, not with fear, but with a calm steadiness that did not waver, as if she saw him exactly as he was. "Nothing more, nothing less. Lena," she said simply, and in that single moment, the balance of power shifted in a way no one could fully explain, because the name carried no weight in his world, and yet it was the only thing that seemed to matter. The name lingered in the air for a moment longer than it should have, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it carried no expectation, no weight, no history that Ethan could measure or place, and that absence unsettled him in a way he did not immediately understand, because every person he dealt with existed within a structure, a network of connections, influence, or consequence. But Lena stood outside of all of it, her presence defined only by what she had done in the last few minutes, and nothing more. And as the city noise slowly returned around them, cars passing, distant conversations resuming, the tension did not fully disappear. It shifted, becoming quieter but deeper, as if everyone present sensed that something irreversible had already happened. And Margaret's hand tightened slightly again on Lena's arm, not out of fear, but out of a quiet insistence, a refusal to let go just yet. And when Ethan noticed it, truly noticed it, something inside him resisted the instinct to immediately correct the situation, to reassert order, to replace the unfamiliar with something controlled. But he did not act on that instinct. Instead, he watched, and in that watching, he began to see more than just the surface of the moment. He saw the way Lena adjusted her stance to better support the weight without drawing attention to it, the way she remained steady without appearing rigid, the way her breathing stayed even despite the quiet pressure surrounding her. And it became clear that this was not hesitation or uncertainty. It was a kind of quiet strength that did not need to prove itself. And that realization shifted something deeper, something that made Ethan glance briefly at his own men, standing ready, trained, disciplined, and yet, in this moment, unnecessary. And that contrast was impossible to ignore, because for all the power he commanded, for all the systems he controlled, none of it had been present in the exact second it mattered most. And that truth settled heavily, not as a threat, but as something far more difficult to confront. And when Margaret finally spoke again, her voice softer now, but steady, "You are staring at her like she has done something wrong." The words were not accusatory, but they carried a quiet clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. And Ethan's gaze returned to Lena, but this time there was no edge to it, no silent test, just observation. And after a brief pause, he exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to be noticed by those who knew him well. And then, without raising his voice, without any dramatic shift, he gave a simple instruction that changed the direction of everything. "Bring the car closer." And for a second, no one moved, not because they did not hear him, but because they were adjusting to the tone, the absence of urgency, the lack of command behind it. And then the driver responded, the vehicle rolling forward just a few feet, smooth and controlled, stopping within reach. And Ethan stepped aside slightly, creating space rather than closing it, his attention still on Lena as he spoke again, this time more directly. "You have done enough. We will take it from here." And the words sounded correct. They fit the structure of his world, but something in them did not quite land the way he expected, because Lena did not immediately move, did not release her hold, and instead she glanced down at Margaret, her voice gentle but firm. "Can you stand?" And when Margaret nodded faintly but did not let go, the answer was already clear, and for a brief moment, the situation hung there again, unresolved, until Ethan made a decision that none of the people watching could have anticipated. He did not repeat himself. He did not assert control. Instead, he reached out, not to take over, but to support, positioning himself beside them, close enough to share the weight without disrupting the balance that had already been created. And in that quiet shift, something fundamental changed, because for the first time, he was not the one in control of the moment, he was part of it. For a moment, the three of them moved as one, not by command, not by hierarchy, but by quiet instinct, each step careful, measured, as they adjusted to the shared balance. And it was in that small, almost unnoticeable coordination that something shifted again, something deeper than before, because Ethan Cole, a man who had built his entire life on control, now found himself matching the rhythm of someone else's pace, aligning his movement with Lena's without a word. And the realization did not come all at once. It unfolded slowly, in the way his hand instinctively adjusted when Margaret's weight shifted, in the way Lena's grip responded without hesitation, steady and assured, as if she had done this countless times before, and the sidewalk that had once felt crowded now seemed to part around them. Not because of fear, not because of power, but because something about the scene demanded space, demanded quiet, and the people who had been watching began to step back, their earlier curiosity replaced by something closer to respect, though none of them could fully explain why. And when they reached the car, the door already open, waiting, there was a brief pause, not awkward, but necessary, as if the moment itself needed to catch its breath, and Ethan glanced at Lena again, this time not searching, not questioning, but acknowledging, truly acknowledging. The role she had played in something that could have gone unnoticed, could have ended differently if she had not been there, and Margaret shifted slightly, her voice soft but clear. She is coming with us, the statement simple, but absolute, and for a fraction of a second, the old instincts surfaced, the structured response, the immediate assessment of risk, of boundaries, of what should and should not happen. But they did not take hold the way they once would have, because something had already changed, something that could not be reversed by routine or expectation, and Ethan did not argue, did not question. He simply nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried more meaning than any command he had ever given, and Lena hesitated then, just slightly, her eyes moving between Margaret and Ethan, not uncertain, but aware of the line she was about to cross, a line defined by class, by space, by a world that had never invited her in. And yet Margaret's hand tightened again, a quiet reassurance, and without another word, Lena stepped forward, helping her into the car with the same steady care she had shown from the beginning, making sure she was seated comfortably before beginning to pull away. But Ethan stopped her, not with force, not with authority, but with a simple gesture, his hand reaching for the door, holding it open, waiting, and it was a small thing, almost invisible to anyone else. But to Lena, it meant something, because in that moment, he was not directing her, not placing her, he was making space for her, and after a brief pause, she stepped in, sitting beside Margaret, the door closing softly behind them, sealing the moment in a way that felt final and yet unfinished at the same time. And as Ethan moved to the other side of the car, the world outside seemed to fall away, the noise fading, the tension dissolving, replaced by a quiet that carried weight. Because inside that car, something had shifted that no one could undo. Not power, not status, not the systems that had defined their lives up until now. And as the engine started and the vehicle began to move, Ethan looked ahead, his reflection faintly visible in the window, but his thoughts were not on the road, not on the next meeting, not on the endless demands waiting for him. They were on a single, undeniable truth that had just revealed itself in the most unexpected way. That sometimes, the strongest thing a person could do was simply stay when everyone else walked away. The car moved smoothly through the city, the outside world slipping past in muted colors and distant motion. But inside, the silence carried a different weight, one that was not empty, but full, dense with unspoken thoughts that none of them rushed to break, and Ethan sat across from them, his posture composed as always, yet something in the stillness of his gaze had changed. Because for the first time in a long while, he was not observing people to assess them, not measuring their worth, their usefulness, or their risk. He was simply watching, taking in the quiet interaction unfolding beside him. The way Margaret leaned slightly toward Lena without realizing it. The way Lena adjusted her position instinctively to support her without making it obvious. And there was no performance in it, no awareness of being seen. Just a natural continuation of the same quiet care that had started on the sidewalk. And That continuity unsettled him more than any sudden act could have, because it meant this was not a moment, not an exception. It was who she was. And as the realization settled deeper, it brought with it a memory he had not revisited in years. One of his mother long before the wealth, before the structure of his world had fully formed around them, when she had been the one offering that same kind of quiet strength to others, when kindness had not needed permission or recognition, and the contrast between then and now was impossible to ignore, because somewhere along the way, that version of her had been replaced by something more guarded, more distant, shaped by the same world he now controlled. And yet here she was, responding to that same kindness again as if it had never left her. And Ethan shifted slightly, his hand resting against the polished interior of the car, his fingers still for a moment longer than usual, as if grounding himself in the present. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, not carrying the authority it once always did, but something quieter, more deliberate. "Are you all right?" The question directed to his mother, but his eyes briefly flickered toward Lena as well, acknowledging her presence in a way that was no longer indirect, and Margaret nodded faintly, her expression softer now, her breathing more even. "I am fine," she said, but she did not release Lena's hand, and that small detail did not go unnoticed, because it spoke louder than reassurance ever could. And after a brief pause, Margaret turned her head slightly, looking at Lena with a warmth that felt entirely genuine. "You did not have to stay," she said, and Lena's response came without hesitation, her voice as steady as it had been from the beginning. "I know," and that was all she offered. No explanation, no attempt to make it sound like more than it was, and once again, the simplicity of it landed heavier than anything else could have, because it removed every excuse, every condition that Ethan had built his understanding of the world around. And for a moment, he leaned back slightly, his gaze shifting to the window, watching the blurred reflection of the city lights as they passed. But he was not seeing them, not really, because his mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying the scene, the stillness, the choice that had been made without hesitation. And when he looked back again, there was something different in his expression, not uncertainty, but recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of something he had not valued the way he should have. And without raising his voice, without drawing attention to it, he spoke again, this time to Lena directly, his tone steady but stripped of its usual distance. "Thank you." And the words were simple, but they carried a weight that no one in that car could ignore, because they were not given lightly, not by him. And for a brief second, the air shifted again, softer this time, as if something had finally settled into place. The word lingered longer than expected, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it had been offered without condition, and Lena did not respond right away, not out of hesitation, but because she seemed to measure the moment differently, as if she understood that what had just been said carried more weight than the sound of it alone. And when she finally nodded, it was small, almost understated, like everything else about her, and yet it acknowledged something real had passed between them, something that did not need to be repeated or expanded. And the car continued forward, the rhythm of the road steady beneath them. But inside, the atmosphere had shifted again, softer now, less guarded, as if the invisible walls that usually defined Ethan's space had quietly lowered without anyone needing to name it. And Margaret adjusted slightly in her seat, her hand still resting lightly against Lena's arm, not holding on as tightly as before, but not letting go either, and she glanced toward her son, studying him in a way she had not in years, as if she were seeing something return that she had thought was long gone. And there was a faint smile at the corner of her lips, subtle but unmistakable, because she understood something that had not yet been spoken out loud, and Ethan noticed it, not directly, but in the way his posture shifted just slightly under her gaze, the way his shoulders eased, as if some quiet tension had been released without him realizing it. And outside, the city began to change, the crowded streets giving way to quieter avenues, the buildings taller, the sidewalks more controlled, the familiar path back to a world where everything had its place. But the moment inside the car did not fully return to what it had been before, because something had already moved beyond that, something that could not be undone by crossing a boundary or entering a different part of the city. And after a few minutes, Margaret spoke again, her voice calm but carrying a gentle certainty. You should tell him where you were going, she said, looking at Lena, and Lena hesitated for the first time, not out of fear, but because the question itself required her to step into a space she had not intended to occupy. And she glanced briefly toward Ethan, then back to Margaret, as if weighing whether the answer mattered. And when she spoke, it was simple, direct. I was heading to work, she said, and Ethan's gaze lifted slightly, focusing on her again, not sharply, but with quiet attention, and Margaret tilted her head just a little, curious. What kind of work? And Lena's answer came just as evenly. I clean offices downtown, early shifts, and the words settled into the space between them, unembellished, honest, carrying no apology and no pride, just truth. And something about that truth created another shift, subtle but undeniable, because it stood in contrast to everything around them, the polished interior, the controlled environment, the distance between their worlds that had always been clearly defined. And yet here they were, sharing the same space without that distance feeling as absolute as it once had. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze thoughtful now, not calculating, not assessing, but reflecting. And after a brief pause, he asked a question that surprised even himself. How far? And Lena answered without hesitation, about 12 blocks. From where you found us. And the simplicity of that distance, something so small in his world, something that could be crossed in minutes without thought, suddenly felt different, because it represented a space where their lives would never have intersected under normal circumstances, and yet they had. And the weight of that realization did not come with drama or intensity. It came quietly, settling into the edges of his awareness, reshaping something fundamental without forcing it. And for the first time, Ethan did not try to control what that change meant. He simply allowed it to exist. And in that acceptance, something else followed, something even quieter, a shift not in power, but in perspective. One that would not disappear when the car stopped. One that would remain long after this moment had passed. The car slowed gradually as the streets outside shifted into something quieter, more controlled, the kind of neighborhood where everything appeared intentional, every building polished, every sidewalk clean. And as the vehicle came to a smooth stop in front of a tall glass building, the contrast between where Lena had come from and where they had arrived became impossible to ignore, and for a brief moment, no one moved. As if the end of the ride required a decision none of them were rushing to make, and Margaret was the first to shift, her hand finally easing from Lena's arm, though not completely, her fingers lingering just enough to show that the connection had not been temporary. And when she looked at Lena, there was a quiet warmth in her expression, something that had not been there earlier in the day, something that had been restored rather than created. You should not be late, she said gently, her voice carrying both gratitude and a subtle insistence that life should continue. And Lena nodded, understanding the meaning behind the words, but she did not reach for the door immediately. Instead, she glanced once more toward Ethan, not seeking permission, not asking anything, just acknowledging that this moment had included him as much as it had included her. And Ethan met her gaze without hesitation this time. And in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed between them again. Something quieter than before, but no less significant, and he leaned forward slightly, his hand resting against the door handle before opening it himself, the movement smooth, deliberate, and when the door swung open, the outside air slipped in, cool and steady, carrying with it the faint sounds of the city continuing as if nothing had changed, and yet everything inside that car had. And Lena stepped out carefully, turning back just slightly to make sure Margaret was settled, a final instinctive gesture that required no acknowledgement. And then she began to step away, her pace unhurried, her posture the same as it had been from the beginning, grounded, steady, untouched by the environment she was leaving behind. And Ethan watched her for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze following not out of suspicion or control, but out of something closer to recognition. And just as she reached the edge of the sidewalk, he spoke again, his voice carrying clearly but without force. Lena, and she stopped, turning back, not startled, not hesitant, simply present. And for a second, Ethan did not speak, as if choosing his words with more care than usual, because this was not a command, not a transaction, not something that could be resolved with a simple exchange. And when he finally did speak, his tone remained steady, but there was something beneath it now, something that had not been there before. "Where is your office?" And Lena answered just as simply as she had before. "2 blocks down, building on the corner." And Ethan nodded once, a small gesture, but deliberate. And then he said something that none of the people watching from a distance could have expected. "We will walk you there." And for a brief moment, the world seemed to pause again, not in shock, not in disbelief, but in quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted beyond the boundaries anyone had assumed were fixed. And Lena did not argue, did not question. She simply nodded once, accepting the offer not as something extraordinary, but as a continuation of the same simple truth that had guided her from the beginning, that sometimes staying present in a moment was all that mattered. And as Ethan stepped out of the car, closing the distance between their worlds not with power, but with intention, the space between them no longer felt like something that needed to be measured, because, in that moment, it had already been crossed. They walked without urgency, without the rigid formation that usually followed Ethan Cole wherever he went. And for once, his men did not close in, did not surround him. They stayed back, as if understanding that this was not a moment that belonged to them. And the distance between the glass building and the corner Lena had mentioned was not far, just a couple of blocks. But it felt longer, not in time, but in meaning, because every step carried something unspoken, something that neither of them tried to define. And Lena moved the same way she always had, steady, focused, her attention on the path ahead, not on the man walking beside her, not on the presence that would have made anyone else pause. And that quiet consistency remained the one thing Ethan could not ignore, because it was not affected by him, not shaped by his world. It existed entirely on its own. And when they reached the corner, Lena slowed slightly, stopping in front of a modest building with a simple entrance. Nothing about it designed to stand out. Nothing about it reflecting the kind of environment Ethan was used to stepping into. And yet she turned toward it without hesitation, as if it was exactly where she belonged. And for a brief moment, they stood there again, the space between them no longer defined by distance, but by what had already passed. And Ethan looked at the building, then back at Lena, his expression thoughtful, not searching for flaws, not measuring worth, but recognizing something he had overlooked for far too long. And Lena gave a small nod, not formal, not distant, just a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had reached its natural end. And she turned to go, her hand reaching for the door. But before she stepped inside, Ethan spoke one last time, his voice calm, steady, but carrying something deeper than before. "If you ever need anything," and he paused, not because he did not know what to say, but because for the first time, he understood that the words themselves were not enough, that what had happened between them could not be reduced to an offer, to a transaction, to something that could be repaid. And so he finished simply, "Let me know." And Lena looked at him, really looked at him, not as someone powerful, not as someone above her, but as someone who had stood beside her when it mattered. And there was no hesitation in her response, just a quiet certainty, "I will be fine." And with that, she stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the street as it had been before, and yet not the same at all. And Ethan remained there for a moment longer, his gaze resting on the door, not waiting, not expecting anything more, just acknowledging that something had ended in a way that did not need continuation. And when he finally turned away, walking back toward the car, his steps were steady, but not as heavy as they once had been, because something within him had shifted, something that would not be undone by the return to routine, something that would follow him long after this street, this building, this moment had faded into memory. And as he reached the car and paused just briefly before getting in, he glanced once more toward the quiet entrance, and there was no dramatic realization, no sudden transformation, just a simple, undeniable truth settling into place, that respect was not something he could demand, it was something he had just witnessed. And that day, without anyone announcing it, without anyone needing to explain it, the world around him felt just a little different. Because for the first time in a long time, power had not led the moment, dignity had.